Time now to continue our look at sleep. Over the last few months, we've looked at various aspects of sleep, and today we're going to look at something that affects 1 in 4 New Zealanders: insomnia. Professor Philippa Gander is from the Sleep Wake Research Centre at Massey University, and I asked her to define insomnia.
Well, actually, insomnia is sort of generally defined as either having difficulty falling asleep or difficulty staying asleep, but it's characterised by a range of symptoms. So the obvious ones are difficulty falling asleep, waking up more than 3 times during the night, having difficulty getting back to sleep when you do wake up during the night, waking up too early in the morning, which gets to be a problem particularly as people get older, or not feeling refreshed when you wake up. So there's sort of standard symptoms of insomnia, but the complicated part is that there are a lot of different things that can cause those symptoms.
We'll look at causes in a moment, but I just want to ask you, is there sort of a common profile for insomnia? I mean, I think of people that I've known that have said to me, I'm an insomniac, and what it seems is they go to bed okay, but they get up at 1 o'clock and their head's racing, and they tend to lie in bed with this battle going on. People often talk about this battle of trying to get to sleep, and they wait. Then at 5 o'clock they're exhausted and they drift off, and they have to get up at 7 and go to work.
That is a classic form of insomnia, but I mean there are lots of different ways that it happens to people. The one that I think we worry about most ourselves, if we're normally healthy sleepers, is having that problem of not being able to get back to sleep. But the causes of that, of course, can be quite diverse. For example, if you take somebody up a mountain, the first few nights you sleep at high altitude, everybody has very poor, light, disturbed sleep. So that's an entirely environmentally caused insomnia. You can also, some people get insomnia from food allergies, and you can, if you find what the food allergy is, then the insomnia goes away. But there can also be a whole lot of sort of behavioural and stress-related and other life factors that can affect it, and there can also be biological causes. So it's actually quite complicated because the symptoms sound the same, but the causes can be quite different. And in that sense, it's like having a stomach ache. There's a heck of a lot of different things can cause a stomach ache.
So how would you know that you are an insomniac?
Well, it gets back to this idea of you have trouble getting to sleep or you have trouble staying asleep,
right,
and that affects the way you function during the day. So that's when you have a problem with insomnia. And in terms of how it's defined, is this a real problem? It depends how long you've had it. So, it may be transient, a few days, a few weeks, or if it's 6 months or more, it's considered to be chronic. And at that point, you would expect that it's probably had a fairly large impact on your lifestyle.
So how many people suffer insomnia?
Well, we have data in New Zealand on the number of adults who suffer insomnia symptoms, and this was a survey that we did of a random national sample of people a few years back with the Eru Pomare Māori Health Research Centre. This was a study led by Sarah Jane Payne, who's currently a PhD student in our lab, and I'll pass it over to her to answer that question.
So Sarah Jane, I mean, how many people are suffering from insomnia?
Well, in the survey that we conducted, we asked people to tell us about these symptoms of insomnia that Philippa has just described. So if we take one, for example, of how often do you have difficulty falling asleep, in the total population of adults in New Zealand, we found that almost 30% of us report that they often or always experience that symptom. If we look at another one, waking 3 or more times during the night, almost 22% of the population are reporting that symptom. So there's quite a large number of people who have one or more of these symptoms in New Zealand. But one of the interesting features of this survey was that we were able to look at the prevalence of insomnia symptoms comparing Māori people to non-Māori people, which is important when we're trying to look at health services and developing treatment services for insomnia. So if we go back to this question of how often do you have difficulty falling asleep, among Māori people, almost 37% reported that this happens often or always, and about 29% of non-Māori adults report this symptom.
Why such variance?
Well, what we found for all of the symptoms was that the prevalence of each was greater among Māori people than non-Māori. But if you look at the information a little bit more closely, what factors are important are actually socioeconomic status, whether or not you are living in a deprived area of New Zealand, and also your employment status, so whether or not you are involved in night work or if you are unemployed.
Was there any difference between male and female, or job status, or different geographic areas?
That was one of the quite surprising findings from our study, because typically people report that women are more likely to report insomnia symptoms than men. But we were the first study that actually controlled for things like socioeconomic factors and employment, and when you control for those factors, the difference between men and women goes away too. So similarly to the ethnicity difference, it's not about gender, it's actually about socioeconomic status and employment.
I guess one of the problems, though, with any survey is that insomnia is episodic, isn't it? It can come and go.
We didn't sort of go for a lifetime prevalence, but what we did ask people is if they've currently got a sleep problem and then how long they've had it. And so that's a much more general question, because it could include things other than insomnia. But what we found was that 25% of New Zealand adults say that they've got a sleep problem that's lasted at least 6 months, which is pretty severe, really.
Was that surprising? Were you surprised?
I think, to me, it was surprising. The duration perhaps was surprising. And in that case, 29% of Māori reported what we consider a chronic sleep problem. Surprising to the extent that we would expect that would have a lot of effect on their other aspects of their lives. And we did ask a series of questions about that, and people who report sleep problems are reporting problems in lots of other areas of their health and well-being as well.
Like what?
Just poorer fare or poorer general health, and difficulties with concentration, difficulty to getting things done. These are the sort of standard questions that you ask about people who are having sleep problems. Difficulty with family and friends, difficulty coping with minor problems. So, things are getting on top of you, basically, when you chronically can't get enough sleep. And then poor physical wellness and poor general quality of life, compared to people who say they don't have a sleep problem.
So is it dangerous if you've got insomnia? I mean, is it something that is actually bad for your health in the long run?
We would expect that it probably is. Certainly if you're not getting enough sleep on a regular basis and you're sleepy during the day, then you've got an increased risk of things like motor vehicle accidents and workplace accidents. But in terms of the long-term effects of insomnia per se on health, I don't think we've got a lot of data on that.
So what sorts of things cause insomnia?
Well, there's lots of different possible things that can cause it, apart from sort of, biological factors. Quite often it can be associated with being very stressed about something, and you get into a sort of state of hyperarousal where you can't relax and fall asleep properly. That can be one of the causes, which is quite common.
And that's just a case of you can't get into that deep sleep
mode.
Well,
you can't relax enough to fall asleep. That's the real problem. And there are quite a few treatments that are effective for that kind of insomnia, which are mainly behavioural. And one of the concerns that we have, so it's getting people to change the way they think about sleep and change their behaviours about going to bed, which can actually be very effective. It's called cognitive behavioural therapy. One of the things that we're very concerned about is there are very few people in New Zealand who can do that kind of behavioural and cognitive training for getting over insomnia problems. And the most common response is for people to be given a sleeping pill, which is not a good response, a good long-term treatment if you've got an ongoing problem.
What are the dangers there with the long-term sort of use?
Well, part of it is that we don't have any data on the long-term effects of sleeping pills. I mean, the drug companies don't test them for long periods of time. And it's probably more important to get to the root cause of what's causing your insomnia, and just masking it, if you like, by taking a pill is probably not unpacking what's really causing it.
What are some of the other causes there? So stress is obviously probably a big one.
I mean, there are a variety of types of insomnia that are associated, for example, with things like depression. Some people, when they're depressed, become insomniac. On the other hand, some people, when they're depressed, actually become extremely sleepy and sleep a lot more. So that it can be related to other kinds of illness. It can be externally caused. You might say that people with a young child who are getting up all the time during the night end up with a form of insomnia, very broken sleep, but that's entirely externally caused.
What about diet? I would imagine, things like caffeine and other stimulants would be...
Certainly, if you have a lot of stimulants on board when you're trying to relax and fall asleep, then you're sort of opposing the brain processes that are trying to slow down as you fall asleep. And so drinking coffee too close to bedtime. A lot of people think that particularly people who drink a lot of coffee, think that they can drink coffee, just before they go to bed, and it has no effect. They can fall asleep, but in fact what it's doing is lightening their sleep right through, so it makes it more likely that they'll be woken up by noise and things in the environment. There's a lot of variability in people's sensitivity to caffeine. I'm very sensitive to caffeine, and if I drink it after sort of 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I can't go to sleep. And I think that's one of those areas where it's quite important to sort of know your own limitations.
Let's look at cures, because there's an industry out there around providing cures, whether it be sort of St John's wort or sort of milky Milo. I mean, a lot of the whole cocoa paradigm is about, helping you nod off. And by the way, does it actually work, having a hot cocoa?
As long as it's not too strong with too much caffeine in it, I suppose.
But does milk actually have any?
There's not anything to say that the nutrient content of something like milk does it, but it might be the behavioural thing. If that's part of your pattern about going to bed, and getting yourself a cup of hot Milo sort of makes you feel secure and relaxed and reminds you of your mother looking after you when you were little, sort of thing, then that's all part of more of a behavioural thing that helps you relax and fall asleep. So one of the things is, have a regular bedtime and have a regular routine about going to bed, which is something that we do for our kids. But it becomes a set of cues that your body learns, that now we're getting into sleep mode, now we're relaxing and getting ready to fall asleep. And so that's probably where the hot Milo fits in more as a behavioural thing rather than some content of the Milo which is making you fall asleep.
What about a hot bath? That's another one, isn't it? That's often wheeled
interesting
out.
Thing with a hot bath, because we know that if you are more physically active during the day and you put your body temperature up, then you get more deep sleep at night, and you can actually do that by having a hot bath too. A hot bath, not too long before bedtime, increases your body temperature, and there does seem to be an association with that and deeper sleep, which is a really odd phenomenon, but that seems to be the case.
So hot bath gets the tick?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Okay, other cures, and we talked about the sort of cognitive behavioural changes. Obviously that involves seeing a professional.
And it does, and part of that is people often get into a sort of system of beliefs and real anxiety about going to bed, particularly if you go to bed every night and struggle to fall asleep, and you can actually learn to associate your bed with being a place where you can't fall asleep. It's sort of like, the Pavlov conditioning with dogs and food.
Don't think of a pink elephant sort of scenario as well.
Yeah, and that's what we call situational insomnia, which is quite interesting, because if you sleep in any other bed, you don't tend to get it. It's only in your own bed where you've learnt to be unable to sleep. And again, there are ways of, training yourself out of that. The thing is, with insomnia, it really is quite important to find out what's causing it, because it can be biological, it can be entirely external. We talked about things like food allergies or being up a mountain, but it can also be behavioural, and quite often what happens is it might have partly a physical origin, but the behaviour that develops around it makes the whole situation a lot worse. So finding out what really is the problem is actually quite important. And as with other sleep disorders, the first port of call is your GP. But there is an issue that GPs are not very well educated yet in this area, and there's also an issue that in New Zealand, although we have a quarter of the adult population saying they have a chronic sleep problem, we have no funding or systematic approach for the treatment of insomnia. And so this is an area where our health services, we're in need of some real systematic look at how the health services for managing insomnia are set up, and how we're going to do this. Because there are lots of effective treatments, there's lots of international literature on how to diagnose insomnia and how to treat it, but in New Zealand very little of that is actually happening.
Last time we talked about the circadian clock and the fact that as you age, you tend to not get as much of that deepest phase sleep. Does that also mean then that as you get older, you're more likely to suffer from insomnia?
Yes, generally the complaints of insomnia do increase with age, for a variety of other reasons as well. And also as we get older, we get more morning type, and a lot of older people worry about the fact that they wake up early in the morning and can't get back to sleep. And partly if you accept that napping in the afternoon is a sensible biological response to that and don't feel guilty about napping, it's actually quite manageable. And it's often a big relief to people to know as they get older that this is actually a natural pattern, and that you can manage it by napping in the afternoon.
Well, I say anything that can give me more guilt-free afternoon napping makes a lot of biological and just general sense. That's Philippa Gander from Massey University's Sleep Wake Centre.